So in this video, we are going to be looking at Gauss elimination method using the system of equation given to us. Now, our first task is to convert or write this system of equation in matrix form. So in matrix form, you have you simply have this, where this represents the column of x, so you simply append x here. This represents the column of y, you simply append y there. And this represents the column of Z, so you simply append Z. Not also forgetting, this is the first row, R1, this is the second row, R2, and this is the third row, R3. Now, the idea behind the Gauss elimination method is to obtain a zero triangular matrix as this. So let's say this is our matrix. So we need the first element in row 2 to be 0. We need the first element in row 3 to be 0. And we need the second element in row 3 to also be 0. So we need to achieve a zero triangular matrix as this, which means we need to make this element to be 0. We need to make this element to be 0. And we need to make this element to be 0 as well. Now, how do you do this? The first task, always keep in mind, is to make the first element in row 3 to be 0. That's the first task. Now, after making this to be 0, your next task is to make the first element in row 2 to be 0. Now, to make the first element in row 3 to be 0, you relate that with row 1. To make the first element in row 2 to be 0, also relate it with row 1. Now, after relating row 3 and row 2 with row 1, your next task now is to relate row 3 and row 2 to make the second element in row 3 to be 0. Okay, so let's do this and see. I want to make this element here to be 0. I will simply look for what I am going to be multiplying to row 1 that will also give me a negative value of what I have. But since I have a positive value here, since I have plus 2 here, then all you need to do is simply multiply row 1 by negative 2 and add that with row 3. Keeping in mind that only the x columns can add, and the y columns can add, and z columns can add. So you can't add the x column and the y column. Okay, our task now is to multiply the whole of row 1 by negative 2 since I have positive 2 here. So if I multiply this one by negative 2 and add a positive 2, it makes this to be 0. Okay, so multiply row 1 by negative 2. So I have something like this, negative 2 r1, then add with row 3 plus r3. Okay, so let's do all of this and see. So we simply have, for the first element in row 1 is 1. So negative 2 times 1 plus the first element in row 2, which is also 2. So plus 2. And this is going to be equal to negative 2 times 1 is negative 2 plus 2. We simply have this to be 0. So we have successfully made the first element in row 3 to be 0. But it doesn't end there. You keep on doing this until you achieve new values for the whole row 3. So we'll move on now. Next element in row 1 is 5. So we have negative 2 times 5. This is now for the y column. Then plus negative 4. So that's simply minus 4. So this is equal to negative 2 times 5 is negative 10. Negative 10 minus 4. This gives us negative 14. Okay, so we have that to be negative 14. Similarly, again, negative 2 times negative 1. So we have negative 2 times negative 1 plus this element here plus 1. Okay, so this is actually negative 2 times negative 1 is plus 2 plus 1. And this simply gives us 3. Finally, we do the same for the constant term. And for the constant term, we simply have, again, you're multiplying row 1 by negative 2. So you have negative 2 times row 1 there. For the constant term, we have 16. Okay, plus row 3, we have here 20. This is equal to minus 2 times 16 gives us minus 32, sorry, plus 20. So this is equal to negative 32 plus 20 simply gives us negative 12. Now we have the new values for our row 3, and these values are what? 0 for the first element, we have minus 14 for the second element, and we have 3 for the third element. And for the constant term, our new value is now minus 12. So we form our new matrix. Alright, so the new matrix becomes So this is now our new matrix. We have row 1 still remains the same, 1, 5, -1, and of course 16. Row 2 still remains the same, 3, 4, 2, and 12. Now row 3 has changed with what? These new values, and we had this 0, -14, 3, and -12. Once again, this is my row 1, this is my row 2, and this is my row 3. Now, I said after making the first element in row 3 to be 0, our next task now is to make the first element in row 2 to be 0 by relating also row 2 to row 1. Okay, by so doing, if here is positive 3, then which means if I multiply the whole of row 1 by -3, since I have here to be positive 1, it becomes -3 times positive 1, which is -3. Adding the two of them together gives me a new value for row 3 and make the first element here to be 0. So therefore, we are simply multiplying row 1 by -3, which is -3 row 1, and adding that with row 2 plus row 2. So let's do this now and see. So -3 row 1 for the first element there is 1 plus the first element in row 2, which is what? 3. This is equal to -3 times 1 is -3 plus 3, and this simply gives us 0. Similarly, we'll do that now for the second element in row 1. We have -3 times 5, add the second element in row 2 plus 4. This is equal to -3 times 5 is -15 plus 4, and this gives us -11. Okay, also -3 multiplied by the third element in row 1, which is -1, plus the third element in row 2, which is 2. So this is equal to -3 times -1 gives us +3 plus 2, and this simply gives us 5. We repeat the same for the constant, and for the constant we have also -3 times the very first element there in the constant is 16. Okay, plus now you add the second element, which is 12. So this is equal to -3 times 12. That gives us -36 plus 12, and this simply gives us -24. Okay, so with this now we form our new matrix for the second row, keeping the first row and the third row constant. So our new matrix becomes, so now we have our new matrix. Observe now, this still remains row 1, this still remains row 2, and this still remains row 3. Okay, so you observe that row 1 still remains the same, nothing changed. Now the values obtained here have been replaced with what? Row 2. Row 3 also remains the same and nothing changed. So you observe now that we've gotten these two rows to be 0. Our next task is to make this second element in row 3 to be 0. In the first instance, you make the first element in row 3 to be 0 by relating that element with row 1. In the second step, you make the first element in row 2 to be 0 by relating that element with row 1. And finally, you make the second element in row 3 to be 0 by relating it with row 2. So we are simply going to relate row 3 and row 2 now. So how do we do this? Notice that I want to make -14 to be 0, and I have over here -11. So in order to make -14 to be 0, I already have -11 here, so which means I can only add these two. Now to do that, I will simply multiply -11 by +14 to give me a negative value. Then now I will multiply -14 by -11 to give me a positive value. So whenever I add the two, positive and negative together, it's going to cancel out. So which means I am multiplying row 2 by -14. So -14 row 2 plus, now I am multiplying row 3 by +11. So 11 row 3. So let's do this and see. So for the first element, remember -14 times the first element in row 2, which is 0, times 0 plus the first element in row 3, which is also plus 11 times the first element in row 3, which is 0. This simply gives me -14 times 0 is 0, plus 11 times 0 is also 0, and I have this to be 0. Now, considering the second element now, we have -14 times the second element there, we have -11 for row 2 plus now positive 11 times the second element in row 3, which is now negative 14. So this is going to be negative 14 times negative 11 is going to give us 145, a positive value. Negative negative becomes plus. Then again, 11 times negative 14, remember, gives us minus 145. So this is equal to 0. Alright, so with that, we have been able to make the second element in row 3 to be 0. And then we proceed now. Again, negative 14 multiplied by, of course, the third element in row 2, 5, plus now positive 11 multiplied by the third element in row 3, which is 1. And this is going to be equal to negative 14 times 5. That gives us negative 70 plus 11 times 1 is 11, and this is actually negative 59. Okay, so we have this. Finally, we do the same for the constant term. And for the constant term, we are simply going to have also negative 14 multiplied by, we have negative 24 here, okay, plus 11 multiplied by negative 12. So this is equal to, let's obtain negative 14 multiplies negative 24. That gives us positive 806, okay, minus, now we have 11 multiplies negative 12. That gives us negative 132. So this result actually gives us 806 minus 132. So we have 674 for the constants. So we write our new matrix now, and our new matrix simply becomes, so this is now our new matrix. Okay, so at this point we have successfully employed the Gauss elimination method, and we have been able to make or form the 3-0 triangular matrix underneath. Okay, so since we've gotten this 0 triangular matrix, we can now employ our Gauss elimination method. Now, not forgetting, this is the x column, this is the y column, and this is the z column. So what you do now is simply equate the coefficients to each of the variables. So starting from the first row, 1 times x gives us x, okay, plus 5 times y gives us 5y, okay, minus 1 times z gives us minus z, and this is equal to the constant there remains 16. Call this equation 1. Similarly, 0 times x is 0, so I have negative 11 times y, that gives us negative 11y. Then I have 5 times z, that gives me plus 5z, and that's equal to negative 24. Call this equation 2. Also, 0 times x is 0, 0 times y is 0. Then I have negative 59 multiplied z, that gives me negative 59z, and this is equal to 674. Call this equation 3. So from equation 3, you can make z subject. This simply implies that z is equal to 674 divides negative 59, and therefore we have a value for z. So z is approximately 11.4. Now, if we know z, we simply put in that value into equation 2 to obtain the value of y. Okay, so we obtain z to be negative 11.4. Putting that value into equation 2, we are going to simply have negative 11y plus 5 into z. Z is negative 11.4, and this is equal to negative 24. Okay, so negative 11y, 5 times negative 11.4 simply gives us negative 57, and this is equal to negative 24. Therefore, negative 11y is equal to, let's simply send negative 57 over to this side. We have negative 24 plus 57. Okay, so negative 11y is now equal to, let's now obtain negative 24 plus negative 57. That simply gives us 33, okay? And therefore, y is simply 33 divides negative 11. This simply implies that y is equal to, this implies that y is equal to negative 3. Okay, now having found y to be negative 3, we simply plug z, the value of z over here, okay, and the value of y into equation 1 to find the value of x. If we do that from equation 1, we have that x plus 5y, and y is negative 3, okay, minus z, and z is negative 11.4. This is equal to 16. So this implies x 5 times negative 3 is negative 15, okay, and then negative times negative 11.4 gives us plus 11.4, and this is equal to 16. All right, so x, now we obtain negative 15 plus 11.4. That simply gives us negative 3.6, and this is equal to 16. Simply send negative 3.6 over here. This implies that x equals 16 plus 3.6. So this simply implies that x is actually 19.6. All right, so the values of that equation are 19.6 for x. We have negative 3 for y, and negative 5, negative 11.4 for z. Alright, so that's the answer to the system of equation using the Gauss elimination method. Alright guys, so that's it on Gauss elimination method. I will see you in the next video with another example. Thanks.